Hi everyone, Mr. Evans here, and today we are on Stranded, assignment number 8, Food Webs. And today you are going to create a food web. In our last assignment, you created a food chain. In fact, you created 5 of them. Today, we're going to create food webs, and they are different. And we're going to talk about the difference between a food chain and a food web. So first of all, remember that we are studying ecology in general, which is the study of living organisms, and we're studying ecosystems specifically. So an ecosystem is all the living things in a given area interacting with each other. So whenever we're thinking one particular area, like maybe Sacramento Valley, or maybe it is the Lake Tahoe Basin, or one specific area, we're talking about an ecosystem. So sometimes those are large ecosystems like the Amazon jungle, and sometimes there's even things called microecosystems. But an ecosystem is a particular area, and we are studying, when we study an ecosystem, how all the living things interact with each other in that area, and also with the abiotic factors as well. So we can model ecosystems by placing multiple food chains together to create a food web. So food chains are what we start with, but a food web is our bigger model of an ecosystem. And this can help us visualize an ecosystem. A food web is a conceptual model. Okay, so we're going to start by getting some of our vocabulary down and specific. So again, a food chain, which we did in our last assignment, is a simple model that describes who eats who in the wild. Okay, it's eat or be eaten. So food chains show this connection of one organism eating another organism, and any organism that eats that organism, etc. And we can have 3 or 4 or 5 several organisms in one food chain. So a food web is a more complex model that describes all the food chains in an ecosystem. So a food web is a more complex model that has many food chains as part of it. So on the first slide, you see an example of a food web. So this food web is a model of a savanna ecosystem. A savanna is an ecosystem that you might find in Africa. So in this, you might see all these different arrows, very similar to the arrows we did in our last assignment. But you'll notice there are a lot more organisms, and you'll also notice that from the organisms, sometimes there's more than one arrow. When we did food chains, every organism just had one arrow. But here you can see that some of these, like this hare right here, this rabbit, has multiple arrows coming from it. And what that means is multiple different organisms might hunt and eat this rabbit here. Now, some of you started to ask yesterday, can more than one arrow go from one organism? So in a food chain, no, we're just doing a simple line of one organism eats another organism. But in a food web, yes. And in fact, most organisms will have multiple arrows, because in real life, one organism can eat several different types of food. So if we were to just look at 3 of these organisms, we might just have a single food chain. So we might have this stargrass right here, which is eaten by the harvester ant, and a harvester ant is eaten by a pangolin, and that would be a food chain. So really, and we could do that for every single connection, and you'd see it's not just one food chain. There's many. If we took all the food chains people did yesterday and put them all into one model, we're starting to have a food web. So what's different here is when we get to an organism like this hare, so this hare eats the grass, but then we see that, again, many things eat the hare. So the hare gets eaten by a wild dog, it gets eaten by a lion, it could get eaten by a cheetah, gets eaten by a caracal, gets eaten by a serval. I mean, goodness, everything eats this poor rabbit, the tawny eagle. So it's got many arrows coming from it because it's food for many different organisms. And that's the same with all these different organisms. We can pick many of them. We could pick, let's see, we could pick this wildebeest and see that even though this is only showing the wildebeest eating one thing, so it shows the wildebeest eats the grass, but then it shows many things eating the wildebeest. Now you had 2 questions at the end of your assignment last time that asked, what do you have at the very bottom of a food chain? It's the same as what you have at the bottom of a food web. What you have at the bottom are producers. So these are your plants. So a food chain and a food web and an ecosystem, which is the real thing, always starts with producers. You have to have producers. They get their energy from the sun, and that's how an ecosystem can start. So then you might have 2 or 3 or 4 layers, but some of you also notice that when you get to the very top of a food chain, just like when you get to the top of this food web, you end up with your top predators. So you end up with things like lions and nothing hunts a lion. You end up with a cheetah and nothing hunts a cheetah, etc. So now we can add in a couple more vocabulary words. So this ecosystem we're talking about, we can see is a community of plants and animals that depend on each other. So they're all interconnected, and we're showing that interconnectedness with a web. And we're going to learn different ways of how things are connected, even when you don't think they're connected. But an ecosystem is a community of plants and animals that depend on each other. They're all part of one area, and they're all interconnected. We can start to see all those interconnections with all these lines. We see how organisms are connected one to another. There are 2 more vocabulary words that you're going to need to know as we study ecosystems. So number 1, and you might think this is simple enough, is species. But if you think about it hard, you might actually be a little confused. What exactly does it mean to be a species? So what it means to be a species is a group of organisms that can mate and produce what we call viable offspring. So in other words, if animals can mate with each other and have babies, then they are the same species. If they cannot, then they're not the same species. So for instance, buffaloes and cows cannot mate and have little baby half buffalo, half cows. It can't happen. They're different species. A giraffe and a zebra can't have babies. They're different species. But on the other hand, if 2 types of organisms can have babies, then they are the same species, even if that is a little surprising. So for instance, we know that wolves and dogs can actually breed, and you can have a half wolf, half dog. And that's because wolves and dogs are actually the same species. They're just a subspecies of each other. So that can happen a lot because the organisms are fairly closely related. They're different subspecies, one level underneath the species, but they are the same species. You can breed a wolf and a dog together because they're the same species. You cannot breed a dog and a fox together. They are not the same species. You can't get puppies out of a fox and a dog. Same thing with a wolf and a fox. They're a different species. They cannot have puppies together. But all breeds of dogs can actually mate with each other and have puppies. It doesn't matter if it's a poodle and a Labrador. We know you can have mixes of those. It doesn't matter if it is a Burmese mountain dog and a husky. They can have puppies together. They're all the same species. Dogs are all the same species. And in fact, they're just a subspecies of wolf. But then, and some of you might be thinking of a couple weird examples in your head, there's this other part to it, viable offspring. And what that means is sometimes 2 different species are very closely related. So they're closely related, but they're still separate species. But if they breed together, they can have babies, but those babies usually aren't healthy, they don't live, or maybe they are not fertile. So there's a couple examples you might be thinking of. Sometimes people say, wait, a lion and a tiger, they can mate and have a liger, because you might have heard of that. Yes, but a liger, which is a mix of a lion and a tiger, is not very healthy. They rarely live. When they do live, they're not healthy. And more importantly, ligers can't have babies. So the DNA is close enough that they can actually have babies, but the DNA is just different enough that they can't keep having more generations. And if you learn about genetics, you understand why that is. So lions and tigers actually are a different species, even though they can breed and have ligers. That's not viable offspring, we call it. Another, if you are from a farm area, you'll know that very more common example is what we call a mule. So horses are one species, donkeys are another species. You can actually breed a horse and a donkey together and you get a mule. But actually mules cannot ever have babies. They just don't. So a donkey and a horse are different species. They're close enough they can actually have babies, We call them mules, but those mules cannot have babies. So they're close enough, but they're not quite the same species. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about a species. And sometimes even the media or TV, sometimes they confuse that. There are sometimes they'll call like a northern species and a southern species of the same animal, but really they're the same species. They're just mistaking what a subspecies is with a species. So scientifically, a species are any group of organisms that can mate and produce viable offspring. And then lastly, we have population. What a population is when we talk about population is all the individuals of a species in a given area. So if we say the population of Folsom, we automatically think of humans, but we actually are just talking about the population of humans in that area. But we could also say, what is the population of dogs in Folsom? And then we would just be talking about dogs. Or we could say the population of mice. And when we're talking about ecosystems, you'll notice that happens a lot. We just are talking about certain species. And when we talk about population, we're just talking about one specific species. Okay, so now we've looked at the different vocabulary. Let's look at how to do today's assignment. So what you are going to do in today's assignment is you are going to make your own food webs. Just like in the last assignment, you made food chains, you're going to make food webs. Now the good news is a food web is just a bunch of food chains, and you do it the same way. You're going to draw arrows from one organism to another, and you're going to point the arrow into the stomach of what it eats. So you're going to do it in two different ways. So you've got slide number 4 and slide number 5 and 6 go together. So what we're going to do is, starting with this one on slide number 4, we're going to start modeling an Arctic sea ecosystem. So we have a bunch of organisms here that you might find in the Arctic, and we're going to start creating a food web. So we do it the same way. In this case, we've already got all the organisms there, and they have little talking bubbles next to them that tell you what they eat. So we can start to make some arrows point. So I'm going to start right down here with this baleen whale. So I'm just going to start at the bottom and work my way and put arrows. I'm going to read every single organism's description, and I'm just going to put arrows into its stomach from everything it eats. So in this case, this baleen whale says, I eat krill and other zooplankton. So krill are little shrimp-like type of animals, and zooplankton are even smaller little teeny organisms. So even though this is a giant, really big organism, a baleen whale, they actually just scoop up a lot of little things from the sea with their mouths. So we need to find some krill, and we need to find some zooplankton that we can draw arrows to. Now you'll notice these sizes of the animals are not proportional, because we'll see this krill is actually really teeny. But we do need to draw an arrow from this krill to the baleen whale. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to click on line, just like we did before. I'm going to select an arrow, and since the arrow goes into the stomach, I'm going to start with the krill. I'm going to point it into the stomach of the baleen whale. I'm going to make my arrow a little thicker, and if you want to, you can also make it a different color if you want to make it a little easier to see. So I'm going to make this one red for our examples. Okay. So this also eats other zooplankton. So I'm going to need to make another arrow. And I could do it the same way, but I also just want to point out that you can always copy and paste and change your arrows. So I can see Control C, Control V, and then I can just point from there to there. And that might be a little bit of a shortcut for you. Okay, so now I've got the krill going into the stomach of the whale and the other zooplankton. Okay, so that's what this eats. Now, we'll just move to the next organism. Okay, so the next organism will go with this toothed whale. This looks like a killer whale or an orca. And it says, I eat squid, fish, and seals. So I'm going to do the same thing with this organism. So I'm going to make a line, and I'm going to say, let's see, I need to eat squid. So here's squid up here. Point it into the stomach of the killer whale. I can change the line weight. I can change the color. Maybe I'll even use a different color. Okay. And then I can do the next one. I eat squid, fish. Okay, so I need to find some fish. So I can go up here, and this time I'll just Control C, and then I'll do the little Control V trick, and I'll find the fish, which is this big fish right here. We'll put that into the stomach. What else? And seals. And then if I look around, there are two different types of seals. So there's a Wendell seal and I'm actually not sure what kind of seal that is. But I'm going to draw two more arrows. So I'm going to draw an arrow from here. Oops. In there. And I'm going to do one more from that seal. Okay. So now I've got, and if you want to ever change where the arrows are, you can adjust them. So now I've got the killer whale done. And you are going to do the same thing. You are going to finish this. I'm going to leave these arrows to help you out to get started, and then you're going to finish all the other arrows that you need to do for this food web. When you're done, you're going to have lots and lots of arrows, just like this example here. Yours will look very similar with just lots and lots of arrows going to and from all the organisms. Don't forget any arrows and don't forget any organisms. So just go organism to organism and draw all the arrows that you need from that organism. That's part one. You have a second part, so now you're going to model another food web and another ecosystem. So you're going to model an oak woodland food web. Last time we used these different organisms to do some food chains. We're going to use those same organisms to do a food web. Now, if we were going to make a more complete food web, I would have you take all of these and put them into your food web, but I'm going to be easy on you, and I'm just going to require that you take any 12 of these organisms, and there are 36, so you just have to take any 12 and make a food web with those 12 that you choose. So you'll just go through, you'll take the ones you want, Control C, you'll put them in here, Control V, you'll probably need to make them smaller. Put 12 of them on this page, and then you will go start connecting them with arrows. So again, you're going to pick any 12 organisms from the previous slide. You're going to put them onto this slide, and you'll have 12 organisms there. You're going to have to make them a little smaller. Then you're going to go through, and you're going to connect them all with arrows, just like you did on the previous one. Now, because you're not using all 36, you're only using 12 of them. You might read some things that aren't there, so you might be missing some arrows, but that's okay because you're only choosing 12 of them. So just put the arrows that you read about in the description. Okay, and that's part 2 of your assignment. Okay, so let's create some food webs. Let's model a couple different ecosystems.